The classics.
Very interesting topic, no doubt, and one that sparked recent controversy, uproar, and heated debate across the book social media landscape in recent weeks and months, which got me thinking, what do I think about the classics? As somebody who has been immersed in literature and English for years, since middle school and high school, who studied it during my university years, who is currently pursuing a Master of Arts in English, but also as somebody who clearly has a big interest in popular fiction, who gravitates normally towards the spooky, the fantastical with horror and fantasy and all these other contemporary novels. What do I think of the classics? I think it's an interesting perspective to explore. I wanted today to talk about my favorite classics, the classics that I do not think are boring, that I would most regularly recommend to just about anyone. This is my list of my favorite and most recommended classics. So, with some of my videos, there's a bit of a caveat. My challenge to myself today was to not talk about any books that I have discussed on this channel before. So, I'm gonna leave out a few notables that I would probably regularly include on the list of my not boring classics that I would recommend to just about anybody. And those include And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This is a book I talked about on, I think, my fall spooky recommendations in 2021, even though it's not really spooky, it's like fun murder mystery type of classic mystery fiction. So I'm not going to talk about this today, but this will go in the honorable mention category. Also in the honorable mention category, a book I included on my favorite books of all time list, Lord of the Flies. No doubt a classic from William Golding. I talked pretty extensively about this book on my favorite books of all time video that I put out a couple months ago. This, another honorable mention. In my final honorable mention in the sci-fi classic space, very revolutionary, is Dune by Frank Herbert. I made my first video ever on Dune, and I've talked about Dune quite a few times. I recommend it to anybody looking for fun sci-fi. It can be quite dense, but incredibly rewarding. I would usually put this on this list, but I've talked about this book far too much. So Dune, the final honorable mention. All right, so my definitive list of not boring classics. First one is going to be Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. This is a dystopian, darkly comedic, satirical novel that focuses on a 15-year-old named Alex who is sort of immersed in this extremely brutal, violent culture that is occurring within the context of this dystopian setting. This is very much so the youth subculture is sort of the enemy of the state, and Alex is sort of eventually caught up in the throes of the plot and sentenced for a certain crime. And the novel sort of explores these themes of ultra violence and order in society, freedom of choice, free will, as well as the capability of evil in human nature through sort of three different parts. It is while Alex is doing all these horrible things to people, him being captured by the state and sort of attempting to be reformed by them, and sort of the after of all of this. And it's very interesting to follow that sort of sequence in Alex's life. It can be a bit of a learning curve. It's sort of written in this created slang that can be tough to decipher and follow in the beginning and at certain points, but you eventually find yourself sort of like thinking thoughts in this weird slang that this is written in. I absolutely loved A Clockwork Orange and definitely want to reread it in the future. The second novel on this list of classics that are not boring, 1984 by George Orwell. Probably one of my favorites on this list. This is like the quintessential individual versus the collective, in my opinion, and explores themes surrounding totalitarianism and sort of the manipulation of truth and facts from like a totalitarian regime, if I were to put it in like bullet points. It's really interesting, and I think the character perspective is really interesting. We follow along with Winston Smith, who essentially works for this overarching totalitarian government that has pretty much taken over the whole world, which is constantly at war with other sort of nations and provinces. And essentially Winston secretly hates the government that he works for, dreams of rebellion and revolt and revolution, and ultimately tries to work towards that in this state of hyper surveillance. It is one of my favorite classics. I would definitely recommend it to anybody who wants to read something thrilling and sort of revolutionary in nature. 1984, one of my favorite novels in general, but also one of the best classics in my opinion. The third book on my list is going to be One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Casey. This is a book that sort of takes place in Oregon Psychiatric Hospital and focuses mainly on this guy named Randall Patrick McMurphy, who essentially fakes insanity for criminal charges in order to serve his time in a hospital rather than prison. So we sort of examine what the practices within this psychiatric hospital look like, sort of a criticism of the treatments like electroshock therapy and lobotomy, and sort of exposes all these pretty terrible things that these people went through in this hospital. I wouldn't call this like a happy-go-lucky read. If you're not feeling that great about the world, it's probably not the best thing to pile on to that, but I think it's a really, really interesting exploration with unique characters in a unique setting. Few powerful, poignant, bright spots in a sea of utter darkness. So if that sounds like your thing, check out One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. My next recommendation, Bradbury's most famous novel, Fahrenheit 451. This one is really, really fun read. Essentially, I'm realizing the pattern with my recommendations. All are very revolutionary in nature, but essentially this is a dystopian novel that centers around the setting that's hyper censored. It is illegal to own or read books, and the firemen are these people who go around, and when there's a report of books somewhere or just information in general, they are burned and disposed of. And our main character is one of those firemen, and he is essentially driven insane by his role in censoring the general public and ends up sort of subverting that cause and becoming a revolutionary again. So if that sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend this book. I think it's thrilling. I think the narration is impeccable. Bradbury's writing at his best in this book, and if you like his other work, you'll love this one. I'm quickly realizing that these recommendations are not going to make you feel great about life in general, but nonetheless, my next recommendation, Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar. This one, again, not the most fun subject matter explored. It's sort of a semi-autobiographical exploration of the descent into mental illness and generally not being well. But the writing from Sylvia Plath in this is so poignant, so tangible. It feels like you're sitting in the room with this person who is just pouring their heart out to you about all their experiences. And it's such a showcase and such personal, visceral, amazing writing. This is one of my favorite books that I read last year. Obviously, with a number of these books, and especially with this one, it comes with many attached trigger warnings. As a fan of fantasy, I absolutely had to include this one. It's The Hobbit from Tolkien. You know what this is about already. If you know Lord of the Rings, you know Tolkien. You know all about Bilbo Baggins and his quest in the wizards and everything that comes with this. So if you like fantasy, kind of see where a lot of it began, check out Tolkien's The Hobbit. This is the quintessential place to start if you're looking for classical fantasy. It's a pretty quick read. A lot of people think it's boring and dense at times, but I find it pretty magical. So if you're into fantasy, if you're looking for classics in the genre, check out The Hobbit. There's nothing else to be said about this book. My next one, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Let's keep the darkness going. Bring it back. Mary Shelley, what a story behind this book. Chilling at a lake house with Lord Byron's place, part of a storytelling contest, come up with the scariest story possible, and she essentially dreams the plot of Frankenstein and begins writing it. Obviously, the biggest misconception is that Frankenstein is the monster. Frankenstein is the doctor who creates the monster. Victor Frankenstein, the real villain in this novel. But essentially, he's a guy who's pursuing science, trying to figure out the secrets of the universe, plays God, and kind of reanimates a body made up of a bunch of different parts from various corpses, and boom, he's created life, and that life becomes extremely intelligent and essentially seeks revenge on the doctor, Victor Frankenstein, for shunning the monster. It is a game of cat and mouse. Very interesting frame story structure with this, where it's a story within a story within a story. You get a lot of interesting perspectives, lots of interesting themes being explored within this novel, and Mary Shelley's best. So check out Frankenstein if you're into gothic fiction or other things that are usually dark. Number 8 on my recommendations from Maya Angelou, the amazing poet, the amazing writer, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This is an autobiographical work exploring Maya Angelou's experience all the way from when she was a young 3-year-old child and sent to live with her grandmother in the American South, all the way up to when she has a kid at the age of 16, and sort of how she fared in the American South during a terrifying part in American history, fighting against racism and trauma and so many other events that occurred within Maya Angelou's life. If you need an empathy check or you need an amazing, interesting read from one of the most talented American writers, check out Maya Angelou's autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Now, this one may be an issue for some people who don't like his writing, but The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway is my 9th recommendation in my top 10 not boring classics. This was sort of received in a mixed manner when it was first published, but a lot of people think it's his best at this point. It's an interesting exploration of masculinity and nature and a bunch of other themes set in Spain during the festival of San Fermin. They say it's pretty much all centered on the running of the bulls over there, but it's much more so about sort of Hemingway's group, the lost generation, during this portion in American history when all these people were sort of disillusioned, coming off the absolute destruction, confusion, unaware of how to deal with World War I. So I think it's a really interesting novel. I love Hemingway's writing. It's short, sharp, to the point. If you're into that kind of thing, if you read other Hemingway works, I would definitely recommend The Sun Also Rises. And it's pretty short, so you can get through it pretty quickly. And my final 10th recommendation on my not boring classics list, Catch-22 from Joseph Heller. This is a sort of darkly comedic, satirical war novel from Joseph Heller, definitely postmodernist, very much so, sort of prodding at all the big solutions that the modernist thinkers had following World War I, and I absolutely love it. This is one of, if not the funniest book in the sort of classic genre that I have ever read. Joseph Heller was an absolute genius writing this. The characters are unforgettable. It has a sort of non-linear narrative timeline where it's hard to sort of track when things are happening. A lot of them are flashbacks and sort of memories, an interesting exploration of the bureaucracy of war. Catch-22, an unforgettable novel. If you're a fan of Kurt Vonnegut, I think you'd love this one. So those are my 10 not boring classics. If you're somebody who absolutely hates the classics or has never even given them a chance or approached them, I'm not saying you have to. I think there are plenty of great books, such as pretty much all the ones behind me, that are not classics, are worthwhile reads. But like contemporary books where there's some duds, some boring ones, and that kind of feel like they were a meaningless use of your time, there are also great ones. And there are also great classics that I think are worth reading. If you think your reading interests sort of line up with my own, I encourage you to read one of, if not all 10 from my list today. I'd love to hear what your favorite classics are. Leave them down in the comments, or tell me what your thoughts on classics are in general. I'm really interested to hear what everybody thinks. Other than that, subscribe, leave a like. We'll see you next time. Peace.